The moment your lips part to begin an explanation, you've already lost. That loss isn't just about logic. It's a collapse of psychological power. And if you've ever felt it, the instant you open your mouth and know you're being dragged onto a battlefield you didn't build, then you understand this. Sometimes what exhausts us most isn't the accusation, but the urge to prove ourselves. Picture the scene. An accusation is launched. It's rarely a direct punch. More often, it's a perfectly calibrated sting, a poison-tipped psychological arrow aimed at the soft spot beneath your confident exterior. It might be a subtle jab at your shortcomings at a dinner party, a vague question about your competence in a leadership meeting, or a lover's cruel twisting of your words. And do you know what's the scariest? Not that they're right, but that right or wrong, that moment still makes you freeze. Then think, what should I say now so they understand? Comillas punto. You feel a sudden, primal heat surge in your chest. This isn't mere indignation. It's a pre-programmed biochemical response. Cortisol and adrenaline spike. The fight or flight mechanism kicks in. Your brain, or more precisely, your fragile demanding ego, screams that you're being misunderstood, that the truth is being distorted, and that you must correct the record immediately. Sound familiar? That feeling that if you don't speak right now, you'll lose your share in other people's eyes. Lose honor, lose status, lose the right to be seen. The craving to prove your innocence or clear your name is a deadly psychological trap. It grows out of a profound fear. Fear of being judged, fear of having to accept imperfection, and fear of your own shadow. And at any age, especially after years of living, after being misunderstood, after being judged, you're even more likely to fall into the familiar reflex. Let me explain. Comillas punto. In the psychology of power, the moment you explain, you do three self-destructive things. First, you validate the accuser's authority. You silently accept that they get to be judge and jury, that their opinion matters enough for you to hold everything and fight for it. In other words, you hand them the right to set the rules. Second, you expose your inner insecurity. The rush to clear your name isn't a sign of truth. It's a sign of an ego that's been badly wounded. You reveal that you need validation from the outside to maintain your self-perception. And sometimes a single look, a single sentence, is enough to make us run for a stamp of approval, that we're still okay. Third, and worst of all, you voluntarily surrender the higher psychological position. Real power never needs to justify its existence. It simply exists. Silence, cold, calm, unapologetically defiant, broadcasts one message: your accusation is too small to deserve my attention. And right there you can ask yourself something brutally honest. Am I trying to be understood, or am I trying to keep my respect? Comillas punto. The more you speak, the more ammunition you hand your enemy. You open the door for them to parse your syntax, twist every detail, and hunt for gaps in your logic. In power's cold arithmetic, weakness isn't making mistakes. It's the frantic hunger to prove you've never made one. And how many times in life have we not lost because of the fault, but because of the panicked way we protected our image? So, be silent. Let the accusation hang in the air with nothing to anchor to. Let others fill the vacuum, and they'll quickly return to their own business. The rush to explain is the move of someone beneath the frame. Composure is the declaration of a true Machiavellian. The instant you open your mouth to explain, you voluntarily place the sword in your opponent's hand. Behavioral psychoanalysis suggests that over-explaining doesn't come from a need for clarity, but from a deep terror of being misunderstood, a quiet fear of social exclusion. You compromise with your ego to soothe the gaze of others. And sometimes, we don't realize it. We pay with our self-respect to purchase a small moment of peace from the outside world. The problem isn't whether your words are sincere. The problem is this: the world doesn't judge you by the honesty of your story. It judges you by the desperation in how you tell it. The frantic attempt to repair someone else's perception is a clear sign of an internal breach. The more you try to patch your story, the more you expose yourself as someone who can't protect themselves through actions, only through words. When you justify yourself, people smell fear. They see your trembling shadow, the hidden hunger to be accepted and approved. And when they detect that fear, they know exactly where to strike. In Machiavellian terms, transparency is weakness. When you explain, you confirm that someone else's negative viewpoint is powerful enough, valid enough, to force you to shift position into defense. You admit you need their permission to be at peace. This is the unwritten law of authority. The one who explains is the one who submits. The moment you spend energy defending, you silently agree that the other person has supreme authority to judge your life, your motives, your worth. Never hand that power to anyone. Never waste your status arguing with people who want to shrink you. Niccolò Machiavelli, the great architect of political realism, dissected a brutal truth. Power is never about whether you're right. Real power is about who holds the frame. That frame isn't just words. It's who defines the context, the rules of the game, and the locus of control in the exchange. Your enemy knows this. If they can position you, they've already won half the war. They're exploiting a fundamental weakness in human psychology: fear of judgment, and the natural craving for order. By attacking you, or slapping a label on you, they force you to react, and therefore they establish a frame of blame. Defensive behavior, even when driven by the ego's desire to prove the truth, is in reality a psychological surrender. It signals silent submission. In this psychological war, they've succeeded in shifting the burden of proof onto your shoulders. Their real target isn't truth, it's domination and the erosion of your posture. They exploit your deep fear of shame. You are no longer the one holding power or shaping reality. The moment you try to prove who you are, you've unknowingly agreed to become the defendant in a courtroom they built. Name the cold truth. Most people drift through life, not as sovereign individuals, but as psychological reflexes. They are emotional puppets, yanked not by violence, but by society's vague expectations and prejudices. This isn't politeness, it's emotional pliability. Their strings are braided from the thinnest thread of all: fear of rejection. They crave external approval to legalize the insecurity rotting inside them. When someone accuses them, even without evidence, they don't respond with silence or steady truth. They launch into long explanations, trying to reduce potential status loss. This is the classic sign of excessive social conformity. They endlessly try to prove they're good, smart, worthy. This is the Jungian tragedy. Their life becomes a compulsory performance scripted by an audience they fear. They're trying to hide the parts of themselves they believe society will punish, the unavoidable shadow. And then, if you step back for a moment, you'll see another possibility, a state most people only brush against for a second before losing it. This is the mind's sovereignty, moving through the world so detached, so sovereign, that outside attacks, insults, criticism, attempts to weaken you, don't just bounce off. They dissolve before they ever touched your psychological surface. An insult isn't information. It's a tool of manipulation disguised as anger. Why do people attack? First, it's the clearest expression of Jung's shadow. The criticisms they aim at you are often the flaws, fears, or resentments they're desperate to deny in themselves. That's projection. Second, it's an attempt to create a reaction loop. The attacker wants to trigger your ego, drag you into a war for attention and validation. The moment you react, you give them the power to control your emotions and your reality. Your absolute stillness is the most ruthless exposure of a weak person's farce. To become untouchable, you must fully shift into an internal locus of control, meaning your self-worth is forged from objective self-evaluation, from living by principles you set, and from your own relentless progress, not from external noise. When you become the absolute architect of your inner universe, other people's insults become a distant echo on a frequency you've stopped tuning. They dissolve because they no longer relate to the structure of your new reality. This is Machiavellian indifference. We're talking about the psychology of non-defense. When the ego is threatened, your brain instantly activates the instinctive fight-or-flight response. Driven by the amygdala, it's a biological relic designed to deal with predators, not with a rival's cold accusation. Over-defense, even if it's only words or appeasement, immediately confirms the guilt theory in your opponent's mind. Your defense isn't exoneration, it's your strongest evidence of guilt. How do you neutralize this inner betrayal? You override the amygdala with calculated silence. When they attack, they crave watching you unravel. The strategy here is active neutralization. Your non-reaction is a deliberate refusal of their power over your feelings and your inner state. It creates a psychological gap, an expectation violation that disorients the attacker. When you refuse to justify yourself, when you refuse the role of victim or accused that they try to assign you, they abruptly lose their footing and momentum. Their aggression rebounds, and their fake confidence turns into real insecurity. Your cold composure becomes a declaration of absolute power. This is the art of using silence, not as a pause, but as a weapon of mass destruction. Every attack, every attempt to humiliate you, is fueled by hunger for power and fear of insignificance. The attacker needs a reaction to prove their action matters. When you respond with total, I see why silence, you deprive the attack of oxygen. That silence creates a psychological void. It drives the attacker into cognitive dissonance. They expected battle. They received emptiness. This is the highest form of manipulation, gaslighting them with your refusal to react. Right now, allow me to insert a brief beat and invite you, and everyone listening, to look back at yourself. How many times have you talked too much, just to be understood? How many times have you explained until you were drained, only to realize the other person didn't necessarily want to understand? They just wanted to see you wobble. If you've been in a moment like that, you can share it in the comments. No need for a long story, even one sentence is enough. I stayed silent, or, I explained. I truly want to know, what happened afterward, and how did you feel? But to achieve this deadly stillness, you must commit an extreme act of inner violence. Kill a part of the Jungian shadow, the part that begs to be forgiven, validated, understood. The need to be understood is every individual's fatal weakness. If you can suffocate the life out of that dependent emotional need, if you can stand steady in chaos, cold as unreadable ice, with the ruthless self-control of a true Machiavellian, you enter a state of supreme danger. Why is it that the moment a sharp, cold challenge appears, your first instinct isn't sovereign silence, but a flood of explanations? That immediate urge to justify yourself isn't respect for truth, it's a deep psychological weakness. When you rush to defend yourself, you've unknowingly made a psychological transaction, you're acknowledging the accuser's right to judge. It starts in childhood. You learned a bitter lesson. The only way to escape punishment was to explain. Your body grew up, gained status, gained rank, but the part of your psyche reacting to accusation is still stuck at age 5. You're running a defense program designed for a child afraid of being sent to the corner. We call this the activation of the internal child, or puer aeternus, the eternal child. The immature fragment of the self that only knows fear-based reaction. Over-justifying also exposes an even deeper fear of social isolation, and a desperate hunger for approval. In Machiavellian terms, immediate justification is a sign of weakness. And here's the most dangerous psychological effect: confirmation bias. By trying to prove your innocence, you unintentionally confirm to the accuser that they have a legitimate reason to doubt you. You agree to play a game whose rules the enemy wrote. Every protective word you speak is you handing them the leash again. Explanation, at its core, is begging. You are actively, almost always unconsciously, assigning the role of supreme judge to nearly everyone you meet. This isn't simple respect. It's a transfer of authority. When you feel compelled to defend yourself in a hurry, to explain your actions at length, what is really happening? This behavior is a submission ritual. Every excuse pouring from your mouth, no matter how elegantly disguised, translates into a painful confession. You are the ultimate judge. I am only the petitioner, the frightened child. Please accept this defense. The energy you pour into justification is the power you give away. In the cold calculus of status and power, begging for acceptance isn't merely a whiff of weakness. It is the definition of impotence. The harder you try to prove you're not guilty, the more you confirm they have the power to sentence you. In the social control game, your defense becomes the evidence against you. It exposes the raw, trembling nerve of insecurity. Machiavelli delivered a brutal truth: it's safer to be respected than to be understood. When you rush to defend yourself, when you dive into explanations, you prioritize being understood. And therefore you sacrifice respect. This is a psychological trap. That rapid defense comes from a selfish need, a deep validation deficit. In behavioral psychology, explaining is a nonverbal signal that you accept the other person's power to judge. By justifying yourself, you silently agree they have the right to demand transparency. You turned yourself into the defendant. Power never explains itself. A king never has to interpret his decree for peasants. The moment the king explains, the decree becomes weak, easily questioned, and most importantly, easily broken. Real power operates through calculated ambiguity and cold silence. Because only when you stop craving to be understood do you become truly respected. We're talking about the deadliest weakness in communication: over-explaining. The moment you start stammering and rambling, you're no longer communicating, you're pleading. You're desperately seeking validation. Why do we do this? Your inner shadow cannot tolerate the idea that you might be wrong. That activation is an intensely powerful psychological signal. You are sending out a weak signal. Your internal stability has been eroded. You've publicly admitted that your peace, your confidence, even your identity, depends on the other person's agreement. A shrewd person, someone fluent in Machiavellian logic, spots that desperation immediately. They see you've moved your locus of control from within to outside, placing it directly in their palm. You just handed them a key, not a key to your house, a key to the most important room, the room that contains your dignity and self-respect. Don't explain, don't clarify. A stoic silence is the strongest signal of power. You misunderstood the nature of this war. The attack was never about truth, it was about truth. It was about power. They accuse you to perform a domination ritual, to see whether you can keep your composure, or whether you'll jump, panicked, to their music. The deadliest mistake in psychological warfare is letting your locus of control fall into someone else's hands. You validated the accusation's legitimacy the moment you bowed into explanation. The first step toward becoming untouchable, an unbreakable player, is realizing this. The courtroom does not exist. You must rebuild your perception of reality. You are the only one who holds the power to judge. When you stop seeing them as people who hold your fate, their accusations suddenly lose weight. They are no longer cold verdicts. They become petty opinions. And opinions, in the end, are just noise. Chaotic sound born from someone else's envy, fear, or private hunger for power. The first tactic is mastery of weaponized silence. They shoot an arrow, a blatant attempt to manipulate you. You look straight at them. Lock your gaze. Keep your face completely neutral, unreadable. This is a deliberate refusal to engage. And you let the silence hang in the air. You've created a psychological vacuum. The human brain panics in ambiguity. Silence in conflict is a kind of torture, because it erases scripts and predictions. When you don't defend, don't apologize, don't explain, you cut off the flow of information, and then the attacker becomes the one forced to move to fill the emptiness. They're pushed into wrestling with their own words. Your silence forces them to confront their own shadow. In Machiavellian psychology, the silent one holds power. The manipulator craves control through noise and drama. But you seize power through the absence of sound. Your silence becomes proof of your invincibility. When you remain silent on purpose, you mirror the other person's energy. You refuse to provide the emotional reaction they crave. The supply. Denied. You create unbearable psychological pressure. They hate silence. It triggers cognitive dissonance at the highest level. They can't reconcile their behavior with your lack of response. They begin to crumble. This is the gray rock method upgraded into a weapon. You become inaccessible. The ultimate goal is to become the void. You can't punch fog. You can't hurt something that has strategically dissolved its own presence. The moment you choose defense, you sign a psychological sentence. You reveal what you fear losing. You expose the emotional boundaries you're most easily triggered at. More importantly, you expose your psychological buttons, handing the enemy the controls to your emotional state. Silence is not absence. It is calculated presence. It is the supreme strategy of Machiavellian thought. It creates a mysterious vacuum that forces them to fill it with their own assumptions. This is where the dark mirror takes effect. When they attack the emptiness, they find no target. Unable to grasp motive, they resort to projection, onto your stillness. Your immobility is a perfect psychological counterattack, without a single word. It produces profound discomfort and cognitive dissonance. They are forced to face the darkness they carry. They realize their attack doesn't shake you, it only exposes them. In the war for power and psychological control, when circumstances force you to speak, you must understand. Defense is a signal of concession. The tactic we need to dissect is conversational aikido, a technique forged from dark psychology. If you must respond, you never push back against the incoming force. You pull it. Dark psychology calls this agree and amplify. The attacker seeks emotional fuel and confirmation of dominance. They want to see you shrink, defend, explain. Instead of opposing them, you gently agree with their premise. Then immediately amplify it, pushing it to a logical or absurd extreme that becomes unbelievable. If they say, "You're always late because you don't respect other people's time," you say, "Absolutely. I'm not just late. I do it on purpose. I use my slowness to remind everyone my time is more valuable than theirs. I'm a master manipulator of time." This instantly creates paralysis inside the attacker. Cognitive dissonance. They can't reconcile the realities. Their mind struggles to decide, are you agreeing sincerely, or mocking them with their own weapon? Confusion is the most destructive counterattack. The only thing worse than being slandered is being trapped in defense, trapped in justification. The attacker expects it. You must turn yourself into a caricature. Instead of backing away, you lean into it. You accept the accusation and amplify it until it becomes absurd. Until it becomes a dark myth, something no one can seriously believe. You wait till it becomes a thief. You caught me. Yes? The truth of my corruption is astonishing. I'm not just greedy. I am greed incarnate. Comillas punto. Why does this work? Because when you answer their seriousness with surreal sarcasm, you strip them of their main weapon, moral superiority. You turn the attack from a courtroom into a ridiculous comedy show. You're using psychological aikido. You take the momentum of their aggression and exaggeration and throw them away with it. By owning the monster they try to define you as, you steal their script, and more importantly, you steal their power. You transform their poison-tipped seriousness into a joke, a throwaway comment. This is cognitive reframing at the highest level. You take your opponent's material and convert it into your own energy. You establish that you are the only architect of reality right now, not them. When you laugh at what they treat as sacred, you make their seriousness look stupid. That completely disarms the attacker. This sends an unmistakable signal. AMUSED mastery. This is the highest state of power. Absolute calm in chaos. It says, I've seen these crude attempts 1,000 times. They entertain me. They slap a label on you, a box. Labeling isn't to understand you, it's to control you. When you get angry and fight the box, you lose. You burn precious energy trying to prove they're wrong. By arguing, you admit they have the right to define you, and therefore the right to define your value. Mastery isn't fighting. It's destroying the box. You ridicule it. You don't need to lower yourself to explain. Instead you send a cold message. These rules don't apply to me. You use contempt as a tool of power. You erase the box from your reality, making their attempt at control meaningless. This shows transcendence. You've outgrown the need to fit the collective frame. If you're defending, it's because deep down, you're afraid. You're afraid the label might be true. Defense is only an echo of the core fear. You lack complete self-acceptance. A manipulator has no power over someone who has fully accepted themselves. Every conflict conversation is a covert war over authority and psychological control. There are always two polarized psychological roles, the judge and the defendant. Absolute power sits with the judge because they control the frame. When you're forced into the defendant role, you immediately lose your locus of control. Why is the defendant role so terrifying? Because it triggers primal fear, passivity. Judgment, the exposure of our shadow. This is where you apply the coldest Machiavellian tactic. Reverse the roles. You must immediately, decisively refuse the defendant role. You don't answer. You redirect the spotlight. You don't merely ask a question. You place a new frame of judgment on the other person. This is the art of power. Never be the one being judged. Always hold the gavel. In psychological warfare, the ultimate defense is not a verbal tactic. It is destroying the opponent's weapon at the source. Answer a question with a question, or turn the lens from your behavior to their motive. When someone criticizes you, the real motive is the craving to maintain order, fear of unpredictability, and the desire to control others' behavior. If you explain, you lose. You must flip the board. You cold, indifferent. Why does the moment I arrive affect your emotional stability so deeply? Suddenly, we're not talking about the clock. We're talking about the locus of control. You've moved the argument from an objective behavior being late to the other person's subjective inner issue, their internal instability. You forced them to analyze their fear of disruption. Now the focus isn't your irresponsibility, it's their insecurity and over-controlling nature. We're not talking about words. We're talking about psychological territory. When your opponent feels their dominance threatened, they retreat to the safe shelter of categorization, trying to label you. You strike back strategically. What makes you feel the need to use labels like that to express your point? You're not disputing the label's content. You're accusing them of intellectual bluntness. You're silently declaring that only people incapable of handling complexity need to rely on simplistic words and cheap label tags. Or, it's interesting that you perceive it that way. You're adopting the role of a neutral observer. You refuse the reality they're trying to impose. You treat their words like a psychologically interesting phenomenon. Unreliable, not authoritative. You dismiss its content. And the killing blow. Did saying that make you feel better? You strip away their moral rationalizations and expose the real purpose. Self-soothing, an attempt to calm their own fear. You turn them from attacker into patient begging for comfort, a low position that is intolerable in the power game. Other people's view of you, their stories, their rushed judgments, is not your business. They're seeing you through the lens of their own fears, deficits and failures they refuse to admit. When you absorb their perception, you grant them extraordinary power to shape your inner reality. Their anger? That's poison they drink themselves. It's their private problem. When you rush to justify yourself, to explain, you accidentally confirm their criticism has value. You carry their emotional baggage. Self-destruction disguised as appeasement. A Machiavellian understands, silence is not admission. Silence is refusal to grant permission. It is the ultimate expression of power. On the psychological battlefield, the strongest weapon isn't fierce resistance. It's refusing to fight. Sometimes the most aggressive move you can make is agree. This is strategic agreement, the agreement of the abyss. The attacker relies on the expectation of conflict, waiting for a reaction, defense, fear, or violent pushback. You strip away that fuel with the fogging technique. You calmly say, "You're right." Yes. Sometimes, I'm very difficult. When you agree, you don't just accept criticism. You pull the chair out from under them. They fall into cognitive dissonance. You hand them victory instantly, making victory meaningless. You satisfy their need to be right, while denying their deeper, darker need to watch you suffer and defend. Your calm acknowledgement of flaws is a challenge. You admit mistakes, yet you keep the emotional key. The attacker's primitive goal is status degradation. Their motive is to transform "you did something wrong" into "you are wrong." You may accept the truth in their statement, but you must never accept the shame or the toxic label they're trying to attach. When they rage, "You're so incompetent, how could you make such a basic mistake?" You answer with one sentence: "You're right. This report contains errors that need fixing. I'll correct it immediately." You leave "so incompetent" outside the discussion. You ignore the insult completely. You apply emotional detachment. You fully own the action, fixing it, but decisively refuse the identity being incompetent. The attacker is trapped in frustration. They try to turn public humiliation into a weapon. You turned it into a simple work management moment. The ability to separate action from identity is the key to protecting reputation. Human nature is revealed, not in victory, but when facing undeniable evidence of error. When a mistake happens, people with fragile egos resist to the end. This is a defense mechanism powered by terror. The weak believe admitting fault will disarm them. They get stuck in the self-serving bias. Now observe people with real competence. When a mistake happens, they don't waste a second on excuses. They calmly look at the evidence and say, "Ah, my fault. I was wrong." This is a cold, ultimate declaration of power. Only someone whose confidence in their overall competence is unshakable has the luxury of easily admitting a small mistake. They're sending a clear message: my core value exceeds the cost of this error. This is the immutable law of dark psychology. 20 words. The other 80 is the nonverbal frame. If you're trying to speak power but your voice shakes, that's emotional leakage. Your nonverbal frame is your internal architecture. The need for approval, insecurity, fear of abandonment, hidden beneath a mask of confidence. That's the shadow expressing itself through body language. People with real power don't listen to what you say. They smell desperation. They're testing whether your locus of control is inside or outside. To control others, you must first control the space within you. You must build an inner structure strong enough to withstand silence. You can only hold that stillness if you've done shadow work, facing, understanding, and mastering the dark, weak, craving aspects of yourself. Only then does your energy shift from "please like me" to "I need nothing from you." Comillas. The pain you feel when criticized doesn't come from the strength of their words. It comes from the fact that you surrendered the weapon long ago. They didn't create the wound, they only touched an existing wound inside you. You're experiencing Jones' shadow activation. The enemy's words cut through your ego defenses and shine light into your vault of fears. Your fear's defense isn't an attempt to prove them wrong. It's a loud, desperate attempt to convince yourself the accusation is false. When someone is accused, and reacts with rage or retaliation, that isn't courage. That is trembling fear. You hurt not because of my words. You hurt because of the confirmation coming from within you. Real power isn't proving you're right. It's the ability to acknowledge and integrate the rejected shadow parts. The tactic of exposing, smearing, or publicly revealing personal mistakes is a direct attack on your ego. It hits so hard because it triggers humanity's most primal fear, the fear of isolation and exile from the tribe. True defense demands a cold act of courage. Stare deeply into your own shadow. Own your flaws with ice-calm honesty. Write them down. Categorize them. Accept they are inseparable. When you've stripped yourself bare in the mirror and accepted your entire self, including the immoral shadow, something miraculous happens. You cannot disgrace a man who has already analyzed and admitted the usefulness of his greed or selfishness. Because when he is criticized, he no longer experiences the shock of humiliation. He simply faces information he already knows more clearly than anyone else. This creates a reverse psychological effect. The attacker, realizing their weapon no longer works, feels frustrated and powerless. That's when external harm transforms into internal armor. You become the owner of your truth, and no one can use that truth to control you anymore. The ultimate challenge, the 7DAY, no defense game. This is war against your most natural instinct and your fragile ego. No matter what happens, you are absolutely forbidden to explain, justify, or rationalize your actions. You'll feel adrenaline rise, followed by a wave of psychological panic. This isn't a hunger for justice. This is perception management. The deepest fear isn't losing a relationship. It's facing the shadow that others are projecting onto you. Every explanation is begging for approval. Your mission is to sit still, inside the fire of that discomfort. In Machiavellian doctrine, silence is not an admission of guilt. It is a strategic retreat. Real power never wastes energy validating itself. These 7 days are a purification. You are training your mind to separate your intrinsic value from the world's approval or rejection. The winner isn't the person who is vindicated. It's the person who needs no one's validation to know who they are. Watch how the puppets react when you suddenly withdraw from the social stage. Their first reaction isn't hostility. It's total confusion. They need you in your old place to maintain the illusion of order. Your withdrawal triggers the broken expectation effect. But after confusion, something even more dangerous appears. Respect. A cold respect reserved for someone who cannot be manipulated. And nothing screams certainty louder than a person who doesn't need to explain why they exist. You stop projecting your need for approval onto the outside world. This is the reclamation of raw energy. You end what's called emotional labor, the constant work of servicing other people's ego and drama. You step out of the child archetype. And you step into the sovereign, an entity whose value is self-evident and non-negotiable. Keep your mystery. Never hand the world the blueprint of your soul. Mystery is the ultimate psychological shield. It forces predators to waste energy guessing while you keep your cards. When you cannot be defined, you become larger than anything they can imagine. Keep your power. Power doesn't live in action. It lives in the potential for action. The wise never corner an opponent with a dramatic display, but with threatening silence. When you keep things hidden, you let them draw their own picture of your strength, and that picture is always stronger than reality. Keep your silence. The power of silence is a ruthless strategy. Your silence forces them to react, forces them to move first, and reveal their cards. This creates a shift in the locus of control. You're no longer the one being questioned. You're the one observing and evaluating. The shift from prey to hunter doesn't require a new weapon. It requires a new mind. The mind of a behavioral psychologist, watching the battlefield. And if I had to wrap it all into one sentence for you to carry after the video ends, it would be the opening line we just traveled a very long circle to return to. The moment your lips part to begin an explanation, you've already lost. Not because you're wrong, but because you gave someone else the right to turn you into the defendant. And when you hold your composure, hold the frame, hold your locus of control, you no longer need anyone's permission to be you.